I'm sitting in a conference room in Vienna, Austria. I'm leading a team across 3 continents. And I'm wondering, how did that little girl who grew up in the Bronx, who sometimes didn't even know where her next meal is coming from, end up in this position? If you are a high-performing career woman, then this video is for you. I'm going to demonstrate to you the possibilities that exist for you if you are more intentional about how you're moving through your career. By the end of this video, I want you to view your career differently. I'm going to start from the beginning. I was born to a teenage mother and a 21-year-old father. They were high school educated, didn't have university degrees, and by the time my mother was 20 years old, she had 3 children. I grew up in the housing projects in the Bronx, the Castle Hill projects to be exact. Not one of the safest places to grow up in. I understood at a very young age what it felt like to be unsafe because of the surroundings and the neighborhood that I grew up in. For those of you who have no experience with the housing projects, I can tell you that most of them are characterized by being very high crime neighborhoods with high police presence, low investment in the school and the education system, and just really can be quite a hopeless environment. And at least that's what my experience was there. When I was raised, my parents' marriage was always teetering on the brink of explosion. My father had a drinking problem. We lived in a high crime neighborhood. My mother suffered from depression, and I understood that if I did well in school, that this somehow made her happy. And that was always one of my motivations to be a good girl and to do well, was because I could bring home my report card and that she would be proud of me. What I didn't understand as a very young child, that I somehow was taking responsibility for my mother's mental state, which no child should be responsible for. I was a bright child, and when I was in elementary school, there were a few teachers that understood that I was a bit more capable than the other students, and they used to give me extra assignments. One of them was my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Bender. I remember her name to this day, although that was decades ago. She was the first person to take me to a restaurant, with my parents' permission, of course, that had a tablecloth and silver, and she was teaching me proper table manners at the age of 10 years old. I also had a teacher in the 5th and 6th grade named Mr. Kaplan, and he encouraged me to be the editor of the school newspaper. I was shy and introverted and also a bit awkward. I was very tall for my age and very skinny, and he encouraged me to go out for the play, so I was acting as well as excelling in my grades. And it was through these teachers that I understood that I could do more and that there was more potential for me. Of course, I didn't know what the word potential meant at that time, but I simply understood that there were more possibilities available to me with the help of other people. My mother was incredibly protective of my sister and I, and she wouldn't let us go out and play with the other children. So therefore, we were quite isolated. And that, coupled with the fact that I was a bright child and I was awkward looking, made me a target for bullying, which was really terrible. And there were times when I really feared for my life when I was going home from school. Of course, now as an adult, that was probably an overreaction, fearing for my life. But I can tell you that I was beaten to the ground by children just because I was different and because I got good grades. So I also understood that having good grades was not always an asset, at least in the neighborhood where I was raised. I went to Atli A. Stevenson High School in the Bronx, and it was not assumed that all of the children who graduated from that school would go to college. But I was lucky enough to enroll in the honors program, which meant that most of the students who participated in that were quite isolated, and we had teachers pushing us, and we had regents level courses, and the education was a little bit more rigorous than one would expect in that neighborhood. We had guidance counselors who encouraged us to apply for university, and I was encouraged as well, and I applied to several. I applied to city schools, state schools, and some private universities. And I actually got into all of them. I decided to go to a private university that was the furthest from my home because I just simply wanted to get out of the housing projects. It was so dangerous because this was a time when crack cocaine was on the market, and so the crime rates had just exploded in my neighborhood. What I didn't consider was that I really couldn't afford that university. So I did get a few grants from the government. I got a partial scholarship from the university, but I had to work to pay for the rest of my tuition and to pay for my books and to pay for my housing. And that's when I understood that being at university was going to be really tough for me. When I got to university, I realized for the first time in my life how poor I really was. You have to imagine that when you grow up in a really tough neighborhood and everyone around you has the same economic circumstances, you don't feel any different from anyone else. But when I got to the campus, kids had cards, they had credit cards. They arrived with their parents who bought furniture and food and helped them unpack their things and even left them money. And I didn't have any of that support at all. My parents dropped me off at the university and they left. And I was left to my own devices. I didn't even have $5 in my wallet. And at that moment, I knew I was really on my own. And this journey to educate myself was going to be something that I had to shoulder myself. It was not a family affair. My dream was to study Spanish, but I decided to study business administration because I thought it would be practical, that I would be able to earn a good living and I wouldn't have any difficulties finding a job. So even at that tender age of 17, I was already starting to make strategic decisions about my future. And I was hardly qualified to do it, but I didn't have anybody to rely on to help guide me with those decisions. When I graduated from university, I took a series of jobs which were probably a bit too small for me. Some of them were answering phones at companies. Another was being a project manager at a sign manufacturing company. And I realized that I did not have a future, or at least not the future that I had imagined myself doing that kind of work. So I made the next strategic decision of my life, which was also a big one. I did a little bit of research and I understood that the demands of the baby boomers were going to be through the roof as it came to healthcare. And I knew that I wanted to do something where I could give back a little bit to society. And so I decided to go back to school to study for my master's degree. And I studied business administration with a minor in hospital administration. That was an incredibly huge decision for me. When I graduated from my MBA program, I got my first leadership job working at a major New York hospital. My team was enormous. The span of control was ridiculous. I probably had at that time about 25 direct reports, but it was important work. I knew what I was working for, and I learned so many lessons along the way. At this hospital, my career was on an upward trajectory, and I kept getting one promotion after the next, after the next. The positions were becoming bigger with more responsibility, larger teams, having managers and supervisors reporting to me. And eventually I made it to become the administrative director of the Women's and Children's Hospital. It was at that time that I met an Austrian man who was doing his research fellowship at the same hospital, and a love story ensued. When he finished his research, he had no intention of staying in the United States. He wanted to go back to his country, which was Austria, and he asked me if I would go with him. So that was another big decision I made in my life. I took a leap of faith. I quit my job and I moved to Vienna, Austria, not speaking a word of German, not knowing whether or not I would have a career, not knowing whether or not I would be able to survive as a native New Yorker in a very quaint European city called Vienna. But I thought to myself, if I could survive getting out of the projects and building a very respectable career, I just reasoned with myself that I could survive anything. When I moved to Vienna, I had two goals. My first goal was to get a paying job, any paying job, and I wanted to make one friend. And I knew if I could do those two things that I would be on my way. And 2 months after arriving, I married that man that I met at the hospital, and we've been married ever since. So 26 years and counting. My career in Europe had quite a slow start, at least at the beginning. I took the first job available to me, and that was teaching English to business executives. I could speak English, I was a relatively good teacher, and that was the place where I met my first friend. It was a humbling experience to go from a six-figure salary to earning what is the equivalent of about $13 an hour. But I was playing the long game, and I just said, this is something I need to do. And because I was fiercely independent, I wanted to have my own money. At the same time, I started to network and attend networking meetings for women. And it was at one of those meetings that a woman stood up and said that she was going on maternity leave and she was looking for someone who could replace her at her company for 6 months while she was out. And I raised my hand. And that led to me interviewing, and I got a temporary job at IBM Austria. So that was my first time working for a major US corporation. And although the contract was only 6 months, I ended up staying there for nearly 15 years. But I have to say something important about my first years at IBM. The first 6 years, I was doing my work, I was going through the motions, executing on whatever tasks were put in front of me, but not doing anything more than that. I had a mentor at that time, and her name was Maria. And Maria pulled me to the side and asked me, "What are you doing?" And I asked, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Is this a job for you or is this a career?" And I was really affronted by what she said, because I thought, well, I'm doing my work well, but so what are you complaining about? But I took that message home and I thought about it, and she was right. I was going through the motions. I was there in body, but not there in spirit. And it was at that exact moment where I decided to take my career in my hands. I decided I will volunteer for any leadership programs, training, stretch assignments. I wanted to become more visible. I wanted people to understand that I was not just a person who was completing tasks, but I was a person who could be strategic and make an impact and contribute to the organizational objectives. And at that moment, that is when my career started to take off like gangbusters. It was unbelievable. Eventually, I was given an assignment outside of the country. So I was leading a team in the next country, which is called Slovakia, and I was commuting to the city Bratislava a few days a week to lead my team. I was responsible for big budget, delivering sales targets every single quarter in a very high pressure environment. And a lot of my career happened after that, and I don't want to go into all of the details, but what I can tell you was eventually I ended up in a global leadership role as the global director of sales enablement for a very large multinational corporation. So I had effectively taken my career from answering telephones at a consulting company in New York, that was my first job after graduating from university, to being a global director at a major company with a lot of responsibility and a huge salary, big benefits and everything. One of the things that I loved the most when I was leading teams, when I was working at IBM and some of the other companies I was with, was that I loved coaching and helping the people who reported to me to reach their highest potential. And I became more invested in the development of the people who reported to me. And I thought to myself, I need to train myself and get licensed as a coach, because I knew what I was doing was coaching, but I wasn't that sure that the methods I was using were the right methods. In parallel to working my corporate job, I became a certified coach. Not only did I get certified as a coach, but I also got a certificate in the area of diversity and inclusion, which is something that I care about very deeply, from Cornell University. And I also started a side hustle where I was doing corporate training in parallel to having my corporate job. So I had a lot of balls up in the air, and I knew eventually that I wanted to leave corporate and start my own business, but I wanted to be practical about it. I wanted to make sure that I was prepared to do those things while I was still getting a paycheck. And eventually I felt prepared enough to end my corporate career and venture out on my own. And I started my own company, which I call Living While Leading. Mainly, I love working with high-performing mid-career women who need support navigating in their career. And essentially, I built a business for something that I would have needed 20 or 25 years ago in my own career. I would have benefited so greatly from having a coach be a sparring partner, an accountability partner, sometimes mentoring me. And so that's what I do. I have a series of clients that I work with individually and in groups, and our main focus is to get them to understand where they want to go, have that North Star defined for themselves, and then to get out of their own way, because sometimes we're our biggest enemies when it comes to achieving our goals or pursuing our goals, and also to be strategic in how we are delivering at the workplace. What my clients get with me is a safe place. They can tell me about everything that they're experiencing at work, and I give them the space to figure out where it is they want to go, and then we work together to plan out how they are going to get there. And there's one thing that I always make very clear to my clients. You can let your career happen to you and just be a bystander and take whatever is coming your way, or you can take charge. We all have more power than we think when it comes to our own careers. And I'm here for the women who are ready to decide to take charge and to be strategic. If you're ready to get personalized strategic support for your career, then I'm here for you. Why don't you book a 30-minute career clarity call with me? You can see the link down below. And let's spend some time together. You would be surprised at how much we can accomplish in a very short period of time. I'm looking forward to meeting you, and I'll see you in the next video.